On July 1st, I was engaged in placing bread in the oven when news was brought to us that there was to be a battle that day. Instantly, all was confusion, and before a moment more had passed, myself and 5 children driving our cows before us, fleeing towards the town of Gettysburg. Hello, I'm Tim Smith with Gettysburg History, and today we're going to talk a little bit about one of the farms on the battlefield. And we thought we'd do little videos on farms on the first day's battlefield, the second day's battlefield, and the third day's battlefield. You know, one of the interesting things about the Gettysburg battlefield is most of the fighting took place on private farms. And, you know, depending on how you count the farms and where they're at, there's probably about 30 farms that make up the area where the battle was fought. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about the McPherson Farm. Of course, we generally name the farms after the person that was living there or owned the farm at the time of the battle. And as you saw in our little fade in to this video, the Edward McPherson Farm, the house no longer stands. It burned in a fire in 1895, although the rebuilt barn is on the same foundation. Now, this area, Cumberland Township, Adams County, Pennsylvania, was settled in the 1730s and 40s by primarily Scotch-Irish immigrants. And Robert Stewart was the earliest owner of this tract of land, which at the time of the battle is about 120 acres. And we know he lived here by 1741. By 1798, a guy named William Breeden owned this property, and there's actually a house listed here, right where the clump of trees are, a small wooden house, a stone and log house. The area, Breeden sold the property to the Reverend David McConaughey in 1802. And David McConaughey was the grandfather of the famous David McConaughey, who was responsible for the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. But the Reverend McConaughey owned the property when the Chambersburg Turnpike was laid out. And in our museum, we have the grading book that discusses the road being laid out through the property of the Reverend McConaughey. Now, McConaughey sold the property to David Ziegler, Michael Clarkson, and John Fuller. And when he sold the property, eventually it became vested in Michael Clarkson. And in some early maps of the battlefield and some early descriptions, they actually refer to it as the Clarkson Farm. It was during Clarkson's ownership of the property that the unfinished railroad was dug through the ridges of the property, through, of course, what we call McPherson's Ridge and Seminary Ridge. And this would be about 1835 to 1837. The railroad project was terminated in 1839, and not coincidentally, Michael Clarkson was actually the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad Project. And maybe not coincidentally, he was accused of fraud, and the railroad was investigated, and Clarkson ended up losing his properties in Gettysburg in a sheriff's sale. It was during that time that the stone house that we refer to as the Mary Thompson House, or Lee's headquarters, was built on this property. And by the time of the Civil War, basically the boundaries of the property are Seminary Ridge. The fence south of us along the Herbst Farm. The woods we sometimes refer to as the McPherson Woods are actually the Herbst Woods on the Herbst property. The line went to a fence on the northern side of the unfinished railroad cut. And basically, the property ran all the way down to Willoughby's Run and just a little bit beyond it. By the 1840s, the property was owned by John B. McPherson. And then, of course, after he died, the property was owned by his son, Edward McPherson. The McPhersons lived in the town of Gettysburg. No one named McPherson ever lived at the McPherson Farm. It was occupied by tenants at the time of the battle, and it was John Slentz and his family. And we actually have an account at the Adams County Historical Society from Mrs. Slentz about the battle. Myself, my husband, and our children, 5 in number, resided on the McPherson Farm just west of Gettysburg. On the morning of June 30th, my husband left with the horses with the intention of taking them to a more secure place, but never succeeded, as the equines were stolen by soldiers. On July 1st, I was engaged in placing bread in the oven when news was brought to us that there was to be a battle that day. Instantly, all was confusion, and before a moment more had passed, myself and 5 children, driving our cows before us, fleeing towards the town of Gettysburg. And they ended up losing their cows on the way, and they ended up all the way on the other side of town at the Farnsworth house. And they spent the battle in the basement of what was Harvey Sweeney's house at the time. They ended up, after that, living in the Lutheran seminary for about 3 months before they could return to the house, which of course was devastated by the battle and used as a hospital afterwards, as there was heavy fighting on July 1st in this area. One last thing about the McPherson Farm property is that, Gettysburg is sort of a microcosm of, farming at the time of the Civil War. And I think it's fascinating when you come here, and of course visitors are fascinated by the appearance of the farmland around Gettysburg, especially all the historic fences. And, the park, the National Park, has over the years undergone many fencing projects on the battlefield. And I have no idea why, but the fence line that was here at the time of the battle is not one that has ever drew the attention of Park Service officials to rebuild. And it's one of the more talked about fences on the battlefield. As a matter of fact, the fence along the southern border of the McPherson Farm, leading from the Herbst woodlot to the seminary, has never been rebuilt. And the fence across the northern side of McPherson's property that was clearly here during the battle has never been rebuilt, except for a small stretch in back of the monument to General Wadsworth on Reynolds Avenue. And I just wanted to mention that the fence that was here along these 2 properties is the original boundary line between, the 1700 settlers that occupied the McPherson property and the 1700s settlers that occupied what we refer to as the historic John Stewart property. And we'll talk about that in another video. But this fence line is mentioned in the accounts of the 147th New York when they refused their flank on the fence. This fence line is mentioned by Lieutenant Colonel J. William Hoffman of the 56th Pennsylvania in the early morning action. This fence line is also traversed by the attack of Junius Daniel against Stone's brigade. Of course, they had clambered this fence and then into the railroad cut in their charge against the Chambersburg Turnpike. So I believe it's one of the most historic features on the battlefield that we have a lot of evidence of that you can't see on the battlefield today. So if you really like the content that we've been putting on our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe.